Hello, I'm Caroline. Welcome to my channel. Thank you for joining me today. For today's video, I'm going to be reading from this book. This is British History Makers, Oliver Cromwell. And I hope you'll enjoy it, so let's get started. Oliver Cromwell. Oliver Cromwell ruled Britain as Lord Protector from 1653 to 1658. For these few years, the country had no king or queen, but was governed as a republic that was known as the Commonwealth. Cromwell came to power because he was a general on the side of Parliament in the civil war against King Charles I. He helped to defeat the king and was one of the parliamentary leaders who signed the order for the king's execution. Warts and all, some people thought Cromwell a good man, others feared him as a cruel tyrant. When an artist was painting his portrait, Cromwell told him to paint his warts and everything. Cromwell was a Puritan. Puritans were a group of Christians who believed in a plain, simple form of worship. They disagreed with the ceremonies and some of the beliefs of both the Roman Catholic Church and the Church of England. Cromwell had a strong personality, an iron will, and a hot temper. He was respected abroad as a strong, patriotic ruler. He tried to govern his country well after many years of civil war, but his harsh methods caused anger, especially in Ireland. When Cromwell died, few people were sad, and most welcomed the return of the monarchy soon after Cromwell's death. The map shows the parts of England and Wales controlled by the king's armies, the Royalists, and those controlled by Parliament's armies, the Roundheads, at the start of the Civil War in 1642. Cromwell said that he would rather have a plain, russet-coated captain that knows what he fights for and loves what he knows, than that which you call a gentleman and is nothing else. When someone asked Cromwell's cousin John Hampden who that sloven was, he replied that Cromwell hath no ornament in his speech, but, should it ever come to a breach with the king, which God forbid, that sloven will be the greatest man in England. Cromwell's England. Oliver Cromwell was born in the quiet country town of Huntingdon on the 25th of April, 1599. Queen Elizabeth I had been England's ruler for more than 40 years. The country was growing stronger and richer. In London, theatregoers cheered two new plays, As You Like It and Henry V by William Shakespeare. England had been at war with Spain on and off since the 1560s. Spain was the leader of Catholic Europe. England was Protestant. The two countries were also rivals for trade and colonies overseas. The defeat of the Spanish Armada in 1588 saved England from invasion, but left many Protestants and Catholics in England fearful of one another. Religious quarrels between Protestants and Catholics were at the root of wars in Europe and conflicts in England. Cromwell grew up in a time of religious disputes. Christians in Europe had been quarrelling ever since the early 1500s. In 1517, a German monk called Martin Luther had protested against the way the church was run. This split the church and began the Protestant movement known as the Reformation. In 1534, Henry VIII declared himself head of the Church of England. In France, a civil war between Catholics and Protestants ended the year before Cromwell was born. Oliver Cromwell's family were Protestants. His parents were called Robert and Elizabeth. Robert owned farmland and was a member of Parliament. Both parents came from families that gained land and wealth after King Henry VIII, Queen Elizabeth's father, had closed down Catholic monasteries. The Cromwells' Huntingdon home had once belonged to a community of nuns. Oliver's grandfather had entertained Queen Elizabeth herself there. The neighbours were mostly farmers, and market day was about the only excitement. Oliver Cromwell was born at the end of Elizabeth I's glorious reign, during which England and the arts had flourished. James VI of Scotland became James I of England when Elizabeth I died. Charles I also ruled both countries. The young Cromwell. Oliver went to the local grammar school in Huntingdon, where his schoolmaster was a stern Puritan. The boy seems to have enjoyed games more than study. Tennis, wrestling, running, swimming, handling weapons, and riding. In 1616, Oliver went to Cambridge University. Here he was noted as a keen player of football, cudgels, or any other boisterous game or sport. His student days were cut short by the death of his father in 1617. Oliver had to return home to look after the estate he had inherited. Fortunately, his father had left his mother comfortably off, and Oliver was later able to go to Lincoln's Inn in London to study law. In London, Oliver fell in love with Elizabeth Bourchier. Her father, Sir James Bourchier, was a wealthy merchant, but he was happy for his eldest daughter to marry a young lawyer from the country. Elizabeth and Oliver married on 22nd of August 1620. They remained devoted to each other all their lives. The couple made their home in Huntingdon, where 6 of their 8 children were born. Cromwell lived the life of a country gentleman. He managed the family lands and in his spare time enjoyed hawking and hunting. He also enjoyed playing dice in the local tavern. Cromwell's mother, Elizabeth Stewart, came from a rich landowning family. Cromwell's wife, Elizabeth Bourchier, was the daughter of a wealthy London merchant. Oliver Cromwell felt most at home in the country among his farmer friends. Although a firm Puritan, he enjoyed country sports such as hawking and shooting. Cromwell was at home in the country. He didn't like what he had seen of London, with its inns and theatres and fine lords and ladies. He felt comfortable among his farmer friends, some of whom were Puritans, and believed the world was full of vanity and badness. These Puritans trudging to church through the snow are American settlers. Cromwell and the King. In 1628, Cromwell had elected a member of Parliament. About this time, he had a powerful religious experience. To him, it was like coming from darkness into light. In 1629, a year after Cromwell entered Parliament, the King dissolved it by telling all the members to go home. Charles I had been king for 4 years and believed that the power of a king was God-given and absolute. If Parliament would not do as he wished by raising taxes, for example, then the king had the right to dismiss it. Cromwell went home to look after his lands. However, he was now on the side of those people who wanted to shrink the powers of the king. Charles I tries to arrest 5 members of the House of Commons in January 1642. Charles I, opening Parliament in 1642, fought wars against France, Spain and Scotland. Scotland still had a separate parliament, and the Scots disagreed with the king over religious questions. Wars cost money, which the king had to find from taxes. Ship money was an old tax paid by coastal towns for defences such as forts and ships. While he ruled without parliament from 1629 to 1640, Charles ordered inland towns to pay the tax as well. This angered people who believed the king must have Parliament's agreement for new taxes. In 1639, Cromwell's eldest son Robert died. Deeply saddened, he turned to politics again. In 1640, he went back to the new Parliament as MP for Cambridge. By now, he was respected across eastern England. He also had important friends and relatives. His cousin John Hampden refused to pay ship money. This angered the king, and Hampden had to go to court, where he lost his case. But Cromwell and other country landowners backed him. Parliament and king were set to collide. John Pym from Somerset was leader of what became known as the Long Parliament that met in 1640. Pym urged members like Cromwell to help reduce the king's power once and for all. The king asked for money to pay for a war with Scotland. In return, Parliament demanded no more king's rule and called for the arrest of two of the king's closest advisers, Archbishop Laud and the Earl of Strafford. Charles then tried to arrest Pym, Hampden and 3 other members of Parliament. He went to the House of Commons, but the Commons refused to hand them over. This was open defiance. Fearing he had lost control of London, Charles moved north to Nottingham. On the 22nd of August 1642, he called on all loyal subjects to join him against his enemies. Civil war had begun. John Pym and John Hampden were 2 of the 5 members of the House of Commons that Charles tried to arrest. The others were Denzil Holles, William Strode and Sir Arthur Hazelrig. People at war. Although Cromwell had no training as a soldier, he knew about horses. When the fighting began, he gathered volunteers to form a troop of cavalry. He also began rounding up good horses for the parliamentary army from farms in eastern England. Prince Rupert, nephew of Charles I, was dashing and brave. He commanded the king's cavalry and won many victories. In the end, he was defeated. Cromwell's Ironsides at Marston Moor in 1644. Each side had an insulting nickname for the other. Roundheads. Parliament's men were called Roundheads because some ordinary soldiers had short haircuts, unlike the ringlets of the upper classes. The king's followers were known as Royalists or Cavaliers. This name came from the Spanish caballeros or horsemen and was meant to suggest that they were in the pay of the Catholic King of Spain. Cromwell led his soldiers into battle for the first time on the 23rd of October 1642 at Edgehill in Warwickshire. The result was a draw. Both sides returned to their camps as rain and mud brought an end to fighting for the winter. In the countryside, most people cared more about tending their crops and livestock than marching off to fight. News of the war spread slowly. Each side put its case in books, news sheets, and pamphlets. Alongside the arguments, they published cartoons that savagely mocked the other side. Being king gave Charles an advantage. To fight against the monarch seemed a treasonous and dangerous thing to do. unless, like Cromwell, you had strong convictions. A cartoon of 1642 shows the Cavalier dog, Puddle, and the Roundhead dog, Pepper, growling insults at one another. Parliament wins. After his part in the victory at Marston Moor, Cromwell got his way. Another new army, the New Model Army, was organised, led by General Fairfax. Discipline was strict, but the men had regular pay. Before this, unpaid soldiers had stolen food and money from the villages they passed through and looted the wagons and bodies of the defeated enemy in the hope of finding money or jewels. In June 1645, Cavaliers and Roundheads faced each other near the Northamptonshire village of Naseby. The day began well for the king, as the greatly outnumbered Royalists drove off some of the Roundhead cavalry. However, Cromwell kept his Ironsides together, and while the Cavalier horsemen chased the enemy across country, he and Fairfax attacked the king's foot soldiers until they broke ranks and fled. Among the captured stores, the Roundheads found bread and cheese for supper. It was the first meal that day for most of them. Each side in the Civil War laid siege to the other side's strongholds. To attack a fortress like Corfe Castle in Dorset, the army camped around it. Starved of supplies and fresh troops, the people inside sometimes gave up without a fight. If not, the besiegers fired cannon at the stone walls to make a hole. Barrels of gunpowder were then placed against the weakened walls to blow them up. Once a wall was breached, the soldiers rushed through to fight hand to hand with pistols and swords. Corfe Castle was reduced to ruins by the parliamentarians after a 6-week siege in 1646 failed to break the will of its defender, Lady Banks. Parliament's army moved on to attack the Royalist strongholds of Newark and Oxford. In 1646, King Charles fled and gave himself up to the Scots, who handed him over to Parliament. The king was a prisoner, but still the monarch. Cromwell hoped that he and other army leaders could agree a peaceful settlement with Charles. Cromwell was tired of fighting and worried that things were getting out of hand. There was wild talk of changing society, a revolution. An ungrateful Parliament ordered the army to disband and go home, without pay. In disgust, Cromwell decided to act. He rode away from London, and on the day he left, a group of soldiers, probably obeying his orders, seized the king. Cromwell in Ireland. In 1649, Cromwell led an army to Ireland. The English had been fighting in Ireland on and off for 500 years in an effort to conquer it, but had always met with fierce opposition. Most Irish people were Roman Catholics. During Elizabeth I's reign, England had tried to make Ireland a Protestant country. The English took land from the Irish and gave it to Protestant settlers, known as planters, from England and Scotland. The Irish resented the settlers and often attacked them. A major rebellion began in 1641, with the Catholics claiming the support of Charles I. Cromwell was determined to put an end to the Irish rebellion. Parliament feared that Ireland might be used as a base for an invasion of England by royalists or foreign enemies such as Spain or France. Cromwell's policy in Ireland was thorough. In several towns his troops slaughtered soldiers and townspeople alike, as well as any Catholic priests found. Irish landowners were banished to Connaught and their estates divided among Cromwell's soldiers. Catholic worship was banned and priests went into hiding. The Siege of Drogheda. This unfinished sketch shows women and children on the barricades, while above Cromwell and his officers watched the bombardment. Because the citizens would not surrender, Cromwell's army stormed the town and killed large numbers of ordinary people. The people in Ireland were very poor. They often went hungry, much because of the land was too boggy to grow good crops. They were also attacked by local leaders or chieftains fighting among themselves. The best land was taken by English and Scottish settlers. The Irish were Catholics, but the settlers were Protestants. After Cromwell's campaign of 1649, the Catholics lost even more rights. The English government divided up the provinces of Ulster, Leinster and Munster among Cromwell's soldiers, reducing the amount of land owned by Catholics from 60% to about 20%. In an area of Ireland still troubled today, the City of London took land for settlers and renamed the city of Derry Londonderry. Henry Ireton fought in Ireland with Cromwell, his father-in-law. In 1650 he captured Carlow and Waterford, but died of the plague the following year during the siege of Limerick. At the town of Drogheda, Cromwell called on the royalist commander to surrender, but he refused. Angry Roundhead soldiers broke through the walls and Cromwell did nothing to stop their savagery. Townspeople, including Catholic priests, were mercilessly slaughtered. A few weeks later, the citizens of Wexford were also put to the sword. By the end of 1649, Cromwell had left Ireland, but the massacres left a legacy of anger and hatred. Cromwell returned in 1650, but the Irish went on fighting for 2 more years. The country was now even more wretched, and many Irish soldiers left to fight in the armies of France or Spain. Catholic Ireland was crushed. James Butler, Duke of Ormond, commanded the Protestant Royalist army in Ireland. During the Civil War, he surrendered Dublin to Parliament and fled to join Royalist exiles in France. At the Restoration in 1660, he was made Lord Lieutenant of Ireland by Charles II. The Commonwealth. After the execution of Charles I, England was a republic for the first and only time in its history. It was named the Commonwealth. The House of Lords was abolished. In the Rump Parliament, all that was left of the Long Parliament, Cromwell was chairman of the Council of State, a new ruling body. Cromwell had crushed rebellion in Ireland. Next, he defeated the Scots at Dunbar in 1650. In 1651 at Worcester, he defeated the army of Charles II, the son of the dead king. For the time being, the royalists gave up hope of putting the young king on his father's throne. Cromwell also dealt firmly with people like levellers who wanted general revolution and a breakdown of the old rules. He wanted peace and gradual reform, but thought Parliament was corrupt and slow to act. In 1653, he did what Charles I had done before him. He dismissed Parliament. Cromwell's disciplined army defeated the Scots force that fought at Dunbar in 1650 in support of Charles II, their newly declared king. Successive monarchs had feared attacks from Ireland, Scotland, and elsewhere in Europe. Cromwell's military and naval strength allowed England a period of peace and prosperity. Between 1649 and 1651, Cromwell re-equipped the navy with 40 great warships carrying heavy guns. Under their protection, English merchants sailed the seas unhindered, and England's enemies were cautious. At home, taxes were high, but Cromwell appointed good judges and saw to it that schools and colleges flourished. Ordinary people now had the chance to become generals, admirals, civil servants, scientists, and diplomats. Cromwell had decided reluctantly that God had chosen him to lead the country. He marched into the House of Commons with 30 soldiers and hustled out the members. Cromwell pointed to the mace, the Speaker's symbol of authority, and asked, "What shall we do with this bauble? Here, take it away." So ended the rule of Parliament, for which the war had been fought and for which the king had lost his life. In 1653, Cromwell was made Lord Protector of England, Scotland, and Ireland. He was now king in all but name. The death of Cromwell. Cromwell was a fond father. When his favourite daughter Betty died in July 1658, he was heartbroken. He had been in poor health since returning from Ireland and was now suffering from malaria. He was taken to London, where he died on the 3rd of September 1658. Cromwell's death came as a shock to his friends and supporters. They arranged a grand state funeral. The procession took 7 hours to reach Westminster Abbey. A wax figure of the Lord Protector was on show, but Cromwell's body had been buried in secret 10 days earlier. Cromwell's son, Richard, became the new Lord Protector, but he wasn't up to such high office and resigned. In 1660, General Monk, head commander of the army, allowed elections. The new Parliament sent a message to France. It invited Charles II, living in exile there, to return as king. In the spring of 1660, crowds cheered the new king as he travelled from Dover to London. The Commonwealth was over. Cromwell was dishonoured as a traitor. His body, which had been embalmed, was taken from its tomb and hung up at Tyburn, London's place of execution for criminals. His head was stuck on a pole above Westminster Hall, where it remained for years. Samuel Pepys, 1633 to 1703, was educated at the same school as Cromwell and admired his school's most famous old boy. Pepys studied at Cambridge University and went on to hold an important position in the Navy Board and to become a member of Parliament. But he's most famous for the diary he wrote. In this, he describes his colourful daily life alongside important events, including the Restoration. He tells about the theatre, the musical performances, the latest advances in science, the gossip at court, and the comings and goings of all kinds of ordinary people. Charles II's coronation procession. The king wanted to bring his people together again after the divisions of the Civil War and Commonwealth. Cromwell's legacy. Under Cromwell, Puritan beliefs took hold in England. Bishops were no longer allowed in the Church of England, and people chose their own church ministers. Because Puritans disliked frivolities, the theatres were closed, but not for long. After the restoration of Charles II, bishops and theatres returned. For ordinary people, life under Cromwell and after him went on much as before. Most were glad to have peace again after the Civil War. Cromwell had few firm ideas about how his country should be governed. He had fought the king because he believed the king had taken too much power into his own hands. By a twist of fate, the death of the king left Cromwell with even greater powers of his own. Cromwell ruled because he believed God told him to. He was most at ease with his soldiers, and he helped to create a strong and well-organised army, a model for future armies. He also improved the navy. This was important for the future of Britain as a trading nation with overseas colonies. After years of upheaval and war, Oliver Cromwell made England strong and respected. His statue stands outside the Houses of Parliament in London. For after Cromwell, no king ever tried to challenge the rule of Parliament as Charles I had done. Along with many other places of entertainment, London's Globe Theatre was closed by the Puritans. Theatrical performances were allowed after 1660, but fewer ordinary people went to them. Charles II was a Protestant, but he disliked the Puritanism of Cromwell's time. During his reign, Puritan religious services were forbidden and Puritans banned from government jobs. Puritan preachers were locked up. A Puritan potmender named John Bunyan was sent to prison for preaching without a license, and there wrote his famous book, The Pilgrim's Progress. The poet John Milton had been editor of the Commonwealth's chief newspaper, and, in fiercely argued pamphlets, he had defended the good old cause. Now blind, the poet wrote in despair that Charles II's return marked the end of freedom and the return of slavery. Cromwell is seen by some as an inhuman figure, but his humanity is apparent in this letter of sympathy to his brother-in-law, Valentine Walton, after the death of Walton's son at Marston Moor. In it, Cromwell refers to his own eldest son's death. "Sir, God hath taken away your eldest son by a cannon shot. It brake his leg. We were necessitated to have it cut off, whereof he died. Sir, you know my trials this way, but the Lord supported me with this, that the Lord took him into the happiness we all pant after and live for." Cromwell's statue outside the Houses of Parliament, London. After Cromwell, no king dared to challenge the rule of Parliament, as Charles I had done. How many more? In Ireland, where Cromwell's brutality still causes bitterness, a minority of Catholic nationalists and Protestant loyalists are still prepared to fight. The official messenger, Blackrod, knocks 3 times on the door of the House of Commons to summon MPs to attend the monarch in the House of Lords for the opening of Parliament. The door is slammed in his face in a ritual that reasserts the supremacy of the House of Commons. And that's the end of this video. I hope you enjoyed it, and if you did, please join me again soon for another one. Thank you for watching.